How do you murder 1.7 million people in 18 months? Not over years, not across a continent. In 3 camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, in a year and a half. The killing rate exceeded almost every other state atrocity in modern history. These weren't labor camps, where prisoners died slowly from exhaustion. They weren't detention centers that became lethal through neglect. They were purpose-built factories of death designed for speed with negligible economic output. The sole function, extermination. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is how industrial efficiency was applied to genocide. At least 44,000 camps, ghettos, and incarceration sites operated across Germany and occupied Europe between 1933 and 1945. When Soviet forces reached Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, only about 7,000 prisoners remained alive, most of them dying. How did a system this vast remain hidden in plain sight for over a decade? Dachau opened on March 22, 1933, less than 2 months after Adolf Hitler took power. It was the first regular concentration camp, and it would operate for nearly 12 years, longer than any other camp in the Nazi system. In those early months, it held political opponents, communists, social democrats, trade unionists. But Dachau was never meant to remain a single site. It became the blueprint. SS officers trained there were dispatched to build replicas, and the camp itself eventually expanded into nearly 100 sub-camps spread across southern Bavaria and Austria, embedded into quarries, armament factories, and rural villages. The system evolved in deliberate stages. By 1940, Auschwitz opened in occupied Poland. Then, on January 20, 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered at a lakeside villa outside Berlin. The Wannsee Conference coordinated the so-called final solution, transforming mass murder from improvised violence into organized administrative policy. Imprisonment had become extermination. The 6 major extermination camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Chelmno, and Majdanek, murdered over 3 million people. Approximately 2.7 million Jews died in the 5 gas chamber killing centers alone. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of the complexes, at least 1.1 million people were killed. Nearly 1 million of them Jews deported from across Nazi-occupied Europe, France, Hungary, Greece, the Netherlands, Italy, and beyond. The trains ran on civilian timetables. The selection ramps operated within minutes of arrival, but the most concentrated killing did not occur at Auschwitz. Between March 1942 and the autumn of 1943, roughly 1.7 million people were murdered at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, a span of about 18 months. Treblinka alone killed an estimated 870,000 in roughly 15 months of operation. This was a rate of killing that has few parallels in modern history. The contrast with the Soviet Gulag is essential to understand. Gulag camps were brutal, often lethal, but they extracted labor, timber, or canal construction. Their economic logic, however perverse, remained productive. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Chelmno produced almost nothing. They had no factories, no industrial output worth measuring. Their entire architecture, the rail spurs, the undressing barracks, the gas chambers, the burial pits, was engineered for one outcome. Prisoners arrived, and within hours, most were dead. A small number were kept alive briefly to process belongings and corpses before being killed themselves. The machinery of death operated with assembly line precision, designed not to sustain life, but to extinguish it as efficiently as possible. These were not camps that became lethal. They were lethal by design. The victims extended far beyond Jewish communities, though Jews remained the central target of the genocide. At Auschwitz alone, the The dead included approximately 75,000 non-Jewish Polish civilians, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 25,000 Roma and Sinti, men, women, and children, gassed in what the SS called the Zigeunerlager, the so-called Gypsy Camp, liquidated in a single night in August 1944. Thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men, and political prisoners also perished there, each marked with a colored triangle that categorized them in the camp's bureaucratic hierarchy. Dachau tells a parallel story of geographic reach. More than 200,000 prisoners from over 40 nations passed through its gates between 1933 and 1945, and more than 41,000 documented deaths occurred on its grounds. Historians widely accept that the true toll was higher, with countless deaths from typhus, starvation, and execution going unrecorded in the final chaotic months. At camps, including Auschwitz, Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Buchenwald, Nazi physicians conducted medical experiments that killed or permanently maimed thousands. At Dachau, Zygmunt Rascher submerged prisoners in icy water to study hypothermia for Luftwaffe pilots. At Auschwitz, Josef Mengele selected twins for experiments involving injections, surgical mutilation, and dissection. At Ravensbrück, women endured deliberate bone fractures and sulfonamide infection trials. The work was not fringe science conducted in secret basements. It was funded, published in German medical journals, and reported up through institutional channels. These experiments were presented as legitimate research contributions, discussed at medical conferences, and integrated into the broader apparatus of state-sanctioned violence. By the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet troops advanced through Poland, and the SS confronted a logistical problem of its own making: millions of witnesses and physical evidence of mass murder. The response was systematic evacuation. Beginning in mid-1944 and accelerating into the winter of 1945, the SS forced tens of thousands of prisoners on what became known as death marches, columns moving westward in freezing temperatures with little food, no adequate clothing, and guards under orders to shoot stragglers. From Auschwitz alone, approximately 60,000 prisoners were marched out in January 1945, days before Soviet liberation. Estimates suggest 15,000 or more died on the roads. US forces reached Dachau on April 29, 1945. The scene they encountered, abandoned rail cars filled with corpses, surviving prisoners reduced to skeletal weight, crematoria still warm, was photographed and filmed immediately. The footage was not treated as neutral evidence. Allied authorities understood that German civilians, and indeed populations across the world, would resist believing what had occurred. Cameramen, editors, and directors, including, in one well-known case, Alfred Hitchcock as a treatment advisor, shaped the material into structured documentary films. Death Mills, released in 1945, was screened in occupied Germany to confront civilians with the crimes committed in their name. The films combined raw documentation with deliberate psychological shock, sequencing images to force recognition. The choice was conscious. Liberation footage would not merely record. It would prosecute in image and in memory. The camera became an instrument of accountability, preserving what denial would otherwise erase. The lasting shock is not only the death toll, it is the geography. The Nazi camp system was not concentrated in a few remote locations. The 44,000 sites stretched from Norway to Greece, from the Atlantic coast to deep inside the Soviet Union. Subcamps stood beside chemical plants, coal mines, and city train stations. Local construction firms poured the foundations. Local railway workers checked the timetables. Local farmers watched columns of prisoners walk past their fields. Some camps killed with industrial speed and produced nothing Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, pure extermination facilities with no economic alibi. Others extracted labor until death. The distinction matters because it reveals intent. A society does not build a facility solely for killing by accident. It is planned, budgeted, staffed, and supplied. The machinery of persecution was locally embedded, and that local embedding is what makes the warning signs recognizable in any era. The names most people recognize, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, are the surface of something far larger. 44,000 sites, camps inside factories, ghettos inside cities, transit points inside ordinary railway stations. Most have no monument, many have no name in public memory at all. The last survivors of the camps are now in their late 90s, and within a decade, direct testimony will exist only in archives. Preservation of that testimony and accurate teaching of the full scale is not optional. Recognizing one camp is memory. Recognizing the system is understanding. The next chapter examines what happened to the perpetrators and how many of them never faced a courtroom at all.